For 8 long months, baby Eli never kicked, never reached, never cried, not even once. Doctors gave up, his parents held on to nothing but fading prayers. In that quiet house at the edge of North Carolina's hills, hope was a whisper drowned by silence, until Shadow came. A German shepherd abandoned by the world, yet drawn to the boy like he knew something no one else did. One stormy night with nothing but lightning outside and heartbreak within, Shadow stood watch, and what happened next defied every diagnosis, every expectation, and every broken heart. Was it instinct? Was it divine? Or was it the kind of love only a dog could carry across the impossible? Estava estor sin decidade. The fog rolled low over the Blue Ridge Mountains that hugged the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. Autumn was in full bloom, leaves painted in amber, and rust drifted lazily through the chilled air, dancing over gravel roads that led to forgotten barns and worn wooden porches. At the edge of one such road stood an old farmhouse, white paint peeling with time, its roof patched by Travis Donovan himself just 3 weeks earlier. The wind whispered through the brittle corn stalks behind the house, but inside time had all but stopped. Megan Donovan stood in the kitchen, her back to the window, hands trembling slightly as she pressed a warm cloth to a glass bottle of milk. She was 34, slender and tall, with soft auburn hair, always tied in a messy bun, and dark circles under her hazel eyes. Once a sharp and spirited ER nurse in Charlotte, Megan had resigned from her position 6 months ago, on the day her infant son, Eli, stopped moving. Eli Donovan, not even a year old, lay in the nursery 2 rooms away. He had been a plump, squirmy baby, the kind who kicked at bathwater and reached for every ray of light. But one freak accident, a sudden seizure in the night, with no known cause, had stolen all motion from his body below the chest. The doctors ran scans, labs, tests upon tests. Nothing, no trauma, no infection, no clear answers, just paralysis. Permanent, they had said. Prepare for lifelong care. Megan didn't believe them. Not at first, but hope, like a candle left too close to a window, had been slowly snuffed out by the cold winds of reality. Her husband Travis had been a construction foreman before the accident. Now at 36, he looked older than his years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard, he never remembered to trim anymore. Travis had grown quiet. He spoke only when necessary, kept his hands busy repairing things that weren't broken. They had left their city life behind after Eli's diagnosis, choosing to live on Megan's late grandmother's property in the hills, a place of isolation. Yes, but also one of silence and perhaps peace. Travis entered the kitchen now, brushing a dusting of sawdust from his jeans. "The fence behind the coop is finally up," he said, his voice rough and low, almost hoarse from lack of use. Megan nodded, unspeaking. Their communication had become like this sparse efficient, like 2 people occupying the same world, but staring at different skies. In the quiet that followed, something scratched at the back door. Megan glanced over and opened it gently. In trotted Shadow, the most unlikely addition to their grieving household. Shadow was a 3-year-old German shepherd, large and imposing, with deep brown eyes that held a quiet intelligence. His fur was a dark sable mix of black and burnished gold, thick and coarse with tufts that curled slightly at his haunches. They had adopted him from a local shelter after seeing a faded flyer posted on the general store bulletin board. No family nervous, not good with other dogs. The clerk had shaken her head when Megan asked. "He doesn't do well with strangers," she warned, "but he's quiet, loyal to the bone." Shadow had not barked once since arriving at the farmhouse. He had sniffed every corner of the house on day 1, and without hesitation stationed himself beside Eli's crib. And there he stayed. Not even a morsel of bacon or a tossed tennis ball could lure him from that post. He ate only when food was placed beside the crib, drank only if Megan brought the bowl to him. Sometimes he would nuzzle Eli's blanket gently, or rest his chin on the edge of the crib and simply watch the sleeping child, with a stillness that unsettled and soothed at the same time. That afternoon, the wind picked up. The clouds thickened over the ridge, casting a silver gloom across the windows. Travis looked toward the nursery. "He still hasn't cried today." "No," Megan replied quietly, her voice tight, or moved. Shadow paced once around the crib, then sat upright, alert as always. In the evenings, Megan sat in the nursery rocker and hummed lullabies Eli no longer responded to. Tonight was no different. She entered with the warmed bottle, brushing past the mobile of wooden stars that hadn't spun in months. Eli lay as always, eyes closed, chest rising, slowly, fingers curled slightly, legs untouched by sensation. Megan looked at him and felt the now familiar ache in her chest. She placed the bottle back on the shelf. He wouldn't drink. Not today. Shadow gave a soft grunt. Megan bent down and scratched behind his ears. "You're the only one who believes he's still in there, huh?" she whispered. "Guess someone has to." She stayed in the room longer than usual. Travis came in later and stood in the doorway. He didn't speak. He just watched her rocking slowly in the chair, Shadow beside her like a sentinel. Then the doorbell rang, an unusual sound here. Travis went to answer it and returned with a package from the city, a stack of medical supplies they had ordered weeks ago. While he sorted through the box in the kitchen, Megan turned to Shadow. "You've got some kind of magic in you, don't you?" she said softly. "If love could heal, you'd have fixed him by now." Shadow blinked slowly, resting his head on his paws. Outside, the sun dipped low, throwing the sky into hues of bruised violet and burnt orange. The first chill of winter threaded through the open windows. The house groaned gently under the wind. Eli remained still. Shadow did not move from his post. Neither did Megan. That night, like so many before, it would pass in silence. But the silence had begun to shift, barely noticeable, like a whisper of movement before the storm. The cold had settled over the hills of Asheville earlier than usual, leaving a thin glaze of frost on the farmhouse windows and stiffening the wooden steps of the porch before the sun even touched them. Inside, the house creaked and whispered with the weight of silence. Megan Donovan moved slowly through her morning routine, not out of laziness, but as if rushing would disturb a world held together by fragile threads. Grief had made her body heavier, her breath more shallow. Once a determined, quick-witted woman with a nurse's mind and a mother's heart, Megan now found herself wandering the halls in worn flannel shirts, her auburn hair unbrushed, her eyes distant. Every few hours she returned to the nursery, not out of obligation, but drawn there by something she couldn't name. Eli lay in the crib, unchanged, unmoving, and yet she checked constantly as though hoping his tiny chest would rise just a little higher than the last time. Travis, on the other hand, had thrown himself into labor. He was often outside before the mist cleared, stacking wood-fixing tools that didn't need fixing, rebuilding fences that had never fallen. He was a broad man with strong hands, but since Eli's paralysis, they trembled sometimes, only slightly. Only when he thought no one was watching. He spoke less now, not out of anger, but because words felt useless in the face of helplessness. And then there was Shadow. The German shepherd had changed since coming to live with them. At first he was watchful, curious, but now he had become something else entirely, a sentry. Shadow rarely left Eli's side. He curled at the base of the crib, by day stood guard through the night, and would not be coaxed away with food or affection. His fur-dark sable, streaked with sun-bleached gold along his spine, bristled at the sound of footsteps. His ears twitched at every creak. If anyone besides Megan or Travis entered the room, he would growl a low, rumbling warning, not hostile, but firm. Travis, once bitten by a dog, as a boy kept his distance. Megan tried to sit with Shadow to gently brush his coat, but even she was met with wary eyes and stiff posture. Only when she sat silently in the rocker a few feet from the crib did Shadow seem at ease. Then one morning, Ruth Monroe arrived. Ruth was Megan's maternal grandmother, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair tied back in a neat bun, deep-set blue eyes, and skin creased from a life lived close to both sun and sorrow. She was small in frame, but had the presence of someone who spoke with conviction and listened with reverence. A devout woman, Ruth wore a silver cross beneath her collar and kept a leather-bound Bible in her cloth bag along with hand cream and peppermint lozenges. When she stepped into the nursery, Shadow looked up sharply. His body tensed. Megan instinctively moved beside her grandmother, prepared to hold her back, but Ruth didn't flinch. She met the dog's gaze without fear, her posture calm. Shadow stood, his ears flattened slightly, but he did not growl. Ruth took a slow step forward, then another. She stopped at the edge of the crib, mere inches from Eli. Shadow remained alert, but did not move to block her. Megan's eyes widened. "He's never let anyone that close," Ruth smiled softly, her eyes never leaving the dog. "He knows I mean no harm," she said. "And I think he understands something deeper." "You believe that I do," Ruth said, placing a gentle hand on the crib rail. Animals like him, they feel the shift between the living and the waiting, and children like Eli. He's not gone, he's just not ready to come back yet. From that day forward, Ruth became a constant presence in the nursery. She brought books, old songs, and a scent of lavender wherever she went. Shadow would rise when she entered, but never growl. He would sit beside her as she hummed occasionally, glancing up as if listening, with more than just his ears. It was a quiet truce, one rooted not in logic, but in trust. Travis watched from the doorway. One afternoon, arms folded, his shirt damp with sweat from work in the barn. "That dog doesn't trust anyone but her. He doesn't need to," Megan said. "She's the only one who doesn't try to change anything." Shadow resumed his position at the crib head, resting gently near Eli's arm, and Ruth, with her hand resting lightly on her grandson's blanket, whispered a soft prayer under her breath, the words barely audible. The house remained quiet. Eli did not move, but for the first time in months, Megan began to believe that stillness didn't always mean absence. Sometimes it meant waiting. And Shadow, he was the one keeping watch. The wind that swept through the Donovan farmhouse that night was colder than usual for early October, biting through the loose shutters and stirring the leaves into frenzied circles along the gravel path. Clouds moved heavy and low over Asheville's ridgelines, blotting out the moonlight and cloaking the hills in a hush so thick it felt like the earth was holding its breath. Inside the house creaked as it always did, but something felt different. Denser Megan couldn't name it. She stood at the sink with a dish towel in one hand, staring out at the blackness beyond the kitchen window. Her reflection, pale and tired, stared back at her. She hadn't left the property in over 2 weeks. Travis had offered to run errands, but even he had started spending more time on the far side of the barn, busying himself with tools he rarely used. Their world had shrunk to this quiet rooms, soft footsteps and the ever-steady stillness of Eli's crib. Shadow, as always, was in the nursery. The German Shepherd had become more than just a protector. He was now a fixture in the room, like the dresser or the rocking chair, silent, constant, unmoving. That evening, Ruth had left earlier than usual, saying she needed to pick up supplies from the local church pantry Megan had offered to go. But Ruth shook her head gently. "Tonight is for watching," she said cryptically, then kissed Megan's cheek and drove off into the twilight. By 9 p.m., Travis had retreated upstairs to work on the closet hinge in their bedroom, a task he'd postponed for months, but now attacked with mechanical focus. Megan sat alone in the living room, leafing through an old baby book filled with milestones Eli had never reached. The silence pressed in, familiar and cruel. Then it happened. A sudden short howl split the air. It wasn't angry nor pained. It was sharp, urgent, and unfamiliar. Megan dropped the book and stood up so quickly, the blanket on her lap tumbled to the floor. Her heart pounded as her bare feet thudded against the wooden floorboards. She ran. The nursery door was open, the room dimly lit by the soft amber glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. Shadow stood with his front paws braced against the side of the crib body, taut eyes locked on the infant within. His ears were back not in fear, but in deep focus. He didn't bark again, only let out a low, breathy sound, half growl, half whimper. "Shadow," Megan whispered, approaching slowly. Her hands trembled. The dog didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward her, for the briefest second, then back to the crib. She followed his gaze and stopped cold. Eli's right hand, small and curled into a natural infant fist, twitched. At first, Megan thought it was her imagination, a trick of the light, a dream bleeding into waking. But then the movement came again, a flutter like the wing of a moth caught in sleep. One finger extended and pulled back ever so slightly. Her breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, inching forward. Her knees buckled as she dropped to the side of the crib, her hand gripping the frame as if it might disappear. Eli? She didn't dare touch him. Not yet. She turned, the voice barely above a rasp. Travis' footsteps thundered down the hallway. Travis appeared at the door, his eyes wide with the panic of a man who'd heard too many cries without hope. What is it?" She didn't answer, just pointed. Travis stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, like the floor beneath him might collapse. His eyes scanned their son's face, then followed Megan's finger to the tiny hand beside him. Another twitch, this one more certain. He exhaled hard, voice cracking. "I saw it, Megan. I saw it." Shadow backed down from the crib, settling on the floor, but keeping his eyes locked on Eli. His tail wagged once, slowly. Neither parent spoke for a moment. They were afraid to name what they'd seen, afraid it would vanish. The second they gave it shape, Travis leaned in, hovering above the crib, his large calloused hands gripping the wooden edge. "Eli," he murmured, "if you can hear me, move again. Please, buddy." Megan wiped tears from her cheeks. Her whole body was trembling. "We need to call Ruth," she whispered. Travis shook his head. "Not yet. Let's just be here." And so, they stayed minutes, maybe an hour, time lost. All shape. Eli did not move again that night, but that single gesture echoed in their bones like thunder. It wasn't a reflex, it wasn't an accident. It was a sign small, impossible, and undeniably real. Later, when Megan finally lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She replayed the moment over and over in her head. Shadow had known. Not sensed, known, he'd felt it coming. That's why he had howled, not out of alarm, but as a signal. Downstairs the night deepened, and the wind rattled the porch swing on its rusted chain. In the nursery, Shadow stayed awake long after the others had slipped into restless dreams. His ears twitched occasionally, but his eyes never closed. He had seen the boy move, and he was waiting for him to do it again. A week had passed since Eli's finger twitched, and nothing in the house felt quite the same. The wind outside still howled through the narrow slats of the barn, and the morning still came with a breath of frost on the windows. But inside the Donovan farmhouse, the silence was no longer oppressive. It felt charged now, like air before a storm. Something had shifted not just in the crib, but in all of them. Megan barely left the nursery. Every morning she would sit beside Eli's crib, with her hands gently resting on the railing, her eyes never straying far from her son's face. She had stopped tracking hours. There was only before the twitch and after. Each day brought a new flicker. Eli's hand would curl, then release. Sometimes his head would list slightly to one side, especially when Shadow let out a low, soft bark, as if some unseen thread connected the two. Travis had grown quiet again. His belief in what he'd seen fought against the years of logic and helplessness he'd internalized since the diagnosis. But the doubt was slowly unraveling. One night, Megan caught him whispering to Eli, when he thought no one was listening. "I know you're in there, buddy. We're still here. Just take your time." Shadow remained Eli's faithful guardian, but his behaviors had evolved. He didn't just sit, he watched with more focus than ever. He would tilt his head when Eli stirred, as if waiting for a sign, then lay down again, tail swishing gently. He began to react less to noises outside the nursery. His world had narrowed like Megan's, to the small, fragile boy, and whatever spark was returning to him. It was during one of those heavy mornings, when the fog sat low and the sky refused to brighten, that the front door creaked open and brought in a different kind of weight. Jack Monroe stood in the doorway, a duffel bag slung across his shoulder, and a deep scowl on his 12-year-old face. He was lanky with sandy blonde hair that stuck up in strange angles under a backwards baseball cap. His eyes, an echo of Megan's, were sharper, harder, a little too guarded for someone his age. Jack was Megan's younger half-brother from her father's second marriage, a boy who'd grown up in Atlanta with little discipline and too much internet. "He's early," Megan whispered to Travis as they greeted him. "I thought he wasn't coming until Thanksgiving. He said his mom had a new boyfriend and they're off to Cabo." Travis shrugged. She sent him with a bus ticket and a bag of chips. Jack stomped into the house without saying much. He barely glanced at Megan before flopping onto the living room couch with all the subtlety of a falling log. "Do I even get Wi-Fi here?" he asked. "Or is this one of those horror movie farms?" "You'll survive," Megan said, trying for a smile. Jack was trouble not malicious, but sour. Sarcastic, dismissive, always performing as though life were a stage where he was too cool to care. He didn't ask about Eli, didn't mention the crib or the strange energy in the house, just plugged in his earbuds and vanished behind a wall of sound. For the first 2 days he barely spoke, but then he met Shadow. Jack had wandered into the nursery uninvited, looking for a phone charger. Shadow had risen slowly from the floor, ears perked, eyes hard, and assessing Jack, froze. "Whoa," he muttered. "Okay, big guy." He took a step back. Shadow did not growl, he only watched. "Guess this is your turf, huh?" Jack whispered. Megan, who had been folding clothes in the hallway, was about to intervene when she saw Jack drop his hand slowly to his side. Palm. Open. Shadow blinked once, then patted forward. He sniffed Jack's hand and sat. From that moment, Jack returned to the nursery a little more often. At first it was for research, as he claimed, "I want to see the miracle baby twitch or whatever." But after a few quiet afternoons, sitting cross-legged beside the crib, his tone softened. He started asking questions not to the adults, but to Shadow. "Did he always look like that?" he whispered one afternoon. "Like..." Frozen. Shadow didn't answer, of course. But the way he shifted closer to the crib, resting his chin near Eli's foot, made Jack stay longer than he meant to. It was on a late Thursday evening, the kind where clouds hung too low to see stars, that Megan caught her brother do something unexpected. He was sitting beside Eli's crib, knees pulled to his chest, one hand resting lightly on the bars. "I don't get it," Jack said softly. "Why does everyone keep watching him, like he's going to wake up? It's not a movie." Megan didn't respond. She stood in the doorway, arms folded hidden behind the frame. Then Jack looked up, his voice smaller. "But what if he does?" Shadow let out a faint bark. Eli's hand moved again, stronger this time. His fingers curled around the soft edge of his blanket, held it, then loosened. Jack gasped. Did you see that?" he shouted. Megan rushed in. "What happened?" He moved. He grabbed the blanket. Travis was already on his way down the stairs. "He did, Mom." I swear. Megan leaned over the crib. Eli's hand was still now, but his fingers remained curled. "It's real," she said, blinking back tears. "It's really happening." Behind her, Jack sat stunned. Shadow stood beside him and pressed his warm body against the boy's shoulder. Jack didn't pull away. He stayed there the rest of the night. The mornings came slower in mid-October, like the sun was reluctant to rise over the hills of Asheville. Mist draped the valley like a gauze curtain, and the air carried the bite of early frost. In the Donovan farmhouse, everything moved with a certain reverence now. No one slammed doors, no one raised voices, even the old floorboards seemed to creak more softly. Jack Monroe sat on the back steps, knees pulled to his chest, hoodie zipped all the way up to his chin. His breath fogged the air in small bursts. Behind him, the screen door creaked open, and Shadow stepped out, silent as ever. Jack glanced sideways at the dog. "You're early." Shadow sat down beside him, his thick sable fur puffed slightly against the morning chill. His ears flicked once at the sound of a bird call, but otherwise remained still. His gaze cast toward the barn. "Guess you don't sleep much," Jack muttered. "Neither do I." The boy leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. In the gray hush of the yard, he began to speak, not loudly, but not quite whispering. "Either. My dad left when I was 6, took his stupid guitar and a bag of laundry, and never came back. Said something about freedom. He kicked a pebble down the step. I used to tell myself he was coming back. Then I stopped. Figured I must have been born wrong or something." Shadow didn't move. "That's why I act like a jerk, you know." Jack added, his voice breaking slightly. "So, people leave faster. Saves time." He scratched the back of his neck, then slowly reached out and laid a hand on Shadow's broad shoulder. The dog didn't flinch. Jack let out a shaky breath. "But you don't seem scared of broken people." Every morning after that, Jack and Shadow walked the perimeter of the property before breakfast. It became their quiet ritual. No words, just boot prints and paw prints in the dew-wet grass circling the farmhouse like they were guarding something sacred. And maybe they were. Inside, Eli was changing. Megan noticed it first. His eyelids sometimes fluttered. He gripped her finger once, faint but deliberate. When Travis leaned close and said his name, Eli's lips parted slightly and he let out a breathy sound that wasn't quite a cry, but wasn't silence either. The progress was slow but undeniable. Jack had started coming into the nursery on his own. He no longer needed a reason or excuse. One afternoon, he stood over the crib and said softly, "You know, it's really rude not to answer when someone talks to you, but I guess you're working on it." Then he smirked and added, "I get that. Took me years to say anything real." That evening, Megan found Jack sketching in the corner of the living room. She didn't know he drew. The paper was filled with quick angled lines. Shadow's posture, the curve of Eli's hand, the shape of a leaf pressed against the window. "You're really good," she said gently. Jack shrugged, not looking up. "It's just something to do." Megan sat on the opposite end of the couch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "You know your dad didn't leave because of you." Jack didn't reply, but his pencil stopped moving. He was scared of staying, she continued, of loving something he thought he couldn't live up to. "That's not your fault." Jack stared at the drawing. You ever get scared of staying? Megan nodded. Every day, but you do it anyway. She smiled softly. Yes. Later that night, Jack tiptoed into the nursery, Shadow at his side. He leaned over the crib and whispered, I think I'm gonna stick around too. But you gotta meet me halfway, little dude. Eli stirred. His head shifted faintly toward Jack's voice. Shadow gave a low, approving huff. Jack stood very still. Did you see that? He whispered to the dog. Shadow's tail tapped once on the floor. Then Eli's fingers twitched again, just a flicker, but toward the voice, not away, like he was following it through the dark. The next morning, Jack walked the yard alone. Shadow had remained curled at Eli's side. Jack didn't mind. He tucked his hands into his sleeves and wandered to the edge of the pasture where frost had settled on the fence posts like powdered sugar. He found a flat stone and sat on it, pulling his hoodie tighter. I think he's waking up, he said aloud to the wind. I think we're both waking up. Behind him, the farmhouse glowed in the new sunlight. The storm came in without warning, thick clouds folding over the hills like a woolen blanket drawn tight across the world. By dusk, the winds howled through the valley with such force that the old oak in front of the Donovan farmhouse groaned and bent under its age. The air crackled heavy with electricity, and something more, a tension no one in the house could name, but all felt pressing in. Travis was the first to mention it. He stood by the window, arms crossed over his chest, watching the tree branches whip like wild arms. Feels like something's about to break. Megan, sitting on the couch with a blanket draped over her shoulders and a baby monitor clutched tightly in her hand, didn't reply. She stared at the screen, where Eli lay in his crib, unmoving as usual, but no longer unfamiliar. Lately there had been more, slight shifts, half-turns of the head. Once even a faint hum-like sound that barely registered on the audio feed. Each new flicker felt like a footstep leading them back toward him. In the kitchen, Ruth stirred a pot of stew on the gas stove. She had returned that afternoon, carrying a wicker basket full of homemade salves, knitted socks, and lavender oil. She wore her usual woolen shawl, her white hair braided down her back like a rope of snow. Ruth had a sixth sense for storms weather, and otherwise, and she'd arrived early uninvited, but expected Jack was upstairs in the guest room sketching again. His drawings had grown bolder, sharper lines, more contrast. One page featured Shadow in a regal pose sitting beneath Eli's crib, like a guardian from an old legend. Another showed Eli's small hand mid-motion, drawn from memory and imagination alike. As the wind picked up the lights, flickered once, twice, and then died altogether. The house fell into darkness. Megan gasped. Travis, I'm checking the breaker. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and disappeared into the basement stairwell. Outside, thunder rolled so close it rattled the glass. Ruth lit a candle with practiced ease, her face glowing gold in the flame. He's feeling this, she murmured. Who? Megan asked, even though she already knew. The boy Ruth said without turning. The veil is thinnest in storms. Upstairs, Jack appeared at the top of the stairs, holding his phone flashlight. The Wi-Fi's dead, he said, then noticed the mood. What's going on? Before anyone could answer, a sharp bark echoed from the nursery. Then another louder, more urgent shadow. Megan dropped the monitor and bolted toward the hall, her breath catching with every step. The barking grew frenzied, broken only by a high-pitched whine that didn't sound like Shadow at all. She pushed open the nursery door. The room was bathed in shadow, lit only by the flickering beam of her flashlight. Rain battered the windows like fists. Ifur in distas derp. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the room in a harsh blue strobe. Shadow stood on all fours, facing the crib, his body tense, tail stiff, barking in short, commanding bursts. His eyes were locked on Eli, and Eli. Eli was crying. The sound was thin, crackling like a violin string, pulled too tight but unmistakable. A cry. Not just breath or murmur, but a sound from deep within, as if something had been waiting in the dark to come forward. Megan fell to her knees beside the crib. Oh my God! Eli Travis burst into the room behind her, flashlight shaking in his grip. What's happening? He's crying, she said, voice breaking. Travis. He's crying! Ruth entered behind them, Jack at her heels. Ruth's candlelight met the flashlight's beam, casting flickers of gold and white across the walls. Eli's arms twitched, one hand lifted shaky, slow, but deliberate. He reached Shadow stepped forward and leaned close to the crib. Eli's tiny fingers opened and reached toward the dark shape before him, brushing the dog's snout with the gentlest of touches. The barking stopped. Silence fell again, but not the dead, stifling silence they'd known for months. This was full of breath of heartbeat of promise. Megan sobbed into her hands. Travis knelt beside her, his face buried in her shoulder. Jack stood stunned, his flashlight trembling. And Ruth. Ruth stepped forward, placed a hand on the crib, and whispered through tears, the love of a creature most would call simple. That is the miracle our Lord has given. Shadow lay down beside the crib, eyes still locked on the boy, but calm now. His tail swept the floor, once Eli blinked slowly, his eyes glossy with tears, and let out another soft whimper. Quieter now, but real. Ruth looked around the room. Let this be your sign. He's coming back to us. Not all at once, but in pieces. Love brought him here. Love will bring him the rest of the way. Jack slowly lowered his phone, eyes damp. No one spoke after that. They stayed in the nursery, the whole family with candles and flashlights, and one loyal dog who had refused to leave when everything else seemed lost. The storm outside eventually moved on, but the storm inside had broken open something more powerful than anyone had dared believe. The week after the storm unfolded like a long-held breath, finally released. The land outside the Donovan farmhouse turned crisp and gold. Leaves fluttered down in spirals, and the air held the tang of apples and damp earth. It was the kind of autumn that made the world feel gentle again. Inside, something had changed, not just in the rhythm of the household, but in its very foundation. The silence that once haunted the walls had lifted. There was music again, soft hums from Megan in the kitchen, the faint sound of Jack's pencil scratching across paper, the distant laughter of Travis when he saw Eli stretch for the first time. Hope had seeped back into the woodwork. Eli's recovery, if it could be called, that came not with a dramatic rush, but with tiny, precious increments. One morning, Megan entered the nursery to find him moving his left leg beneath the blanket. Another day, he turned his head toward the sound of Travis's voice and blinked slowly, deliberately. Ruth, ever the quiet sentinel, said it best. He's remembering how to live. The family knew they had to bring Eli to the hospital, not because they feared a setback, but because the world outside needed to see what love had done. Megan made the appointment with Dr. Elaine Myers, the pediatric neurologist who had been following Eli's case since the diagnosis. Myers was a composed woman in her mid-50s with tightly curled gray hair, a no-nonsense wardrobe of navy pantsuits, and a reputation for brilliant precision and cold realism. She didn't believe in the mystical, but she did believe in patterns, and Eli had never fit any. At the hospital, nurses paused mid-step as Eli was wheeled in. He wasn't hooked up to monitors this time. He didn't come in limp or silent. He came in with his eyes open, following a finger reaching for Megan's necklace. With tiny grasping hands, Dr. Myers examined him thoroughly, her brows furrowing deeper with every reflex he managed to respond to. She asked to see videos Megan had recorded of the first signs. His finger twitched the cry, the hand reaching towards Shadow. When the exam was done, the doctor stepped back, folded her arms, and said quietly, "I don't have an explanation. Not a scientific one." Megan looked up. "But it's real, isn't it?" "Oh, it's real," Dr. Myers said. "And if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. I can document this as a partial neurological reactivation. But that won't tell the story." Ruth, who had insisted on joining them for the visit, leaned on her cane near the window and spoke without looking away from the skyline. "You don't need to name it, doctor. Just bear witness." Dr. Myers exhaled slowly. "Well, consider it witnessed." Back at the farmhouse, Jack was in his room, with the door closed and the curtains drawn. He was surrounded by sheets of paper, dozens of pencil drawings, watercolor washes, inked outlines. At the center of the floor lay a hand-bound booklet made of textured recycled paper, stitched together with red thread. He titled it, in bold black letters across the front shadow, and Eli, The Waking Journey. The journal opened with sketches of the storm of flickering candlelight, and the moment Eli reached toward Shadow. Each page that followed was a mixture of observation and personal reflection. Jack included short captions, sometimes poetic, sometimes blunt. He cried, "Not just noise. It was the sound of coming back." Shadow knew before we did, maybe because he was listening with something deeper. He drew the family, Megan seated with Eli in her lap, her face half lit by morning sun. Travis sanding a wooden toy at the workbench, Ruth silhouetted in prayer beside the window, and Shadow ever present sometimes at the crib, sometimes curled at Jack's feet, always watching. Jack submitted the journal to his art teacher, Mr. Caleb Ross, a man in his late 30s with shaggy brown hair and a slightly crumpled fashion sense. Mr. Ross had always admired Jack's raw style, but had never seen the boy invest emotion in his work before. He flipped through the pages in stunned silence, his throat tightening at one of the final entries, a watercolor of Eli laughing, his eyes wide and alive, one hand resting atop Shadow's head. When he handed it back, Mr. Ross said, "Only this is more than an assignment." Jack shrugged, but his voice was soft when he said, "It's the only way I knew how to tell the truth." Back home, Shadow had taken to sleeping beside Eli's crib, with less tension in his posture, more peace. Megan no longer watched him like a mother on edge. She joined him sometimes curled on the nursery floor with a book in one hand and the other resting on Eli's mattress. That week, Travis built a low wooden bench for the nursery window. He placed a small plaque beneath it, hand-carved "Love, kept watch here." Autumn had returned to the valley. The trees lining the Donovan property stood ablaze in hues of fire and gold, and the air carried the kind of crispness that turned every breath into memory. It had been a full year since the storm, a year since the howl, since the cry, since Eli reached out toward something that could not be seen but was deeply felt. The field behind the farmhouse had been cleared that morning, the grass mown into wide paths and folding chairs arranged in loose circles. Paper lanterns hung from twine lines between two old birch trees. At the far end of the field, Travis had built a simple wooden arch. Nothing extravagant, just cedar beams, bound with rope and woven with marigolds and late-season sunflowers. Hanging from the center of the arch was a wooden sign carved by hand, "Faith, Fur, and Miracles." Megan stood near the edge of the setup, holding a small stack of folded napkins, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She wore a soft gray dress, her auburn hair braided to the side, a single yellow daisy tucked behind one ear. Her eyes scanned the field, not out of anxiety, but quiet disbelief. A year ago, she would not have believed this day was possible. Jack adjusted a small camera on a tripod near the arch, muttering to himself. He had grown taller, his voice deeper, though he still wore that same backwards cap. His journal had been published in the school's art showcase, and the principal had invited him to speak at the winter assembly, where he had surprised everyone, including himself, with a speech that made half the audience cry. He still didn't like to talk much about feelings, but he'd found a way to show them. Travis was over by the grill, flipping hot dogs and burgers for the neighbors and family friends who had arrived slowly throughout the day. Among them was Mrs. Clara Jensen, a retired school teacher with white bobbed hair, a habit of over-apologizing, and a purse that clinked with peppermints. There was also Kevin Rourke, Travis's childhood friend, a mechanic with permanently stained fingernails and a booming laugh that cut across the field like thunder. At the far edge, under the shade of a persimmon tree, sat Ruth in her rocking chair. She wore a thick shawl, a rust-colored skirt, and her favorite cross pendant. Her eyes were closed as she rocked, lips moving silently in prayer, or perhaps in song. It was hard to tell. And then came the moment. The back door of the farmhouse opened and a hush fell. Megan appeared, first walking backward, slowly holding the hand of a boy who had once known only silence and stillness. Now, at 2 years old, Eli Donovan walked slowly, carefully between two metal bars of a child-sized walker. His steps were deliberate, but strong, guided not just by therapy, but by instinct and encouragement. His soft brown hair fluttered in the breeze, and his eyes, deep, round, and alert, sparkled as he looked ahead. Beside him, Shadow paced gently, tail swaying. The German shepherd's coat was a little grayer around the muzzle. Now his gait slightly slower, but the loyalty in his posture remained unchanged. His harness strap had been shortened, so Eli could hold it from his walker, and the boy's tiny fingers wrapped around it like it was a lifeline. Gasps rose from the crowd, not dramatic but tender. Hands flew to mouths, a few people quietly wept. Megan let go of Eli's hand, and for the first time in his young life, the boy took 3 steps forward alone, guided only by Shadow and the quiet wind. He crossed beneath the wooden arch, and just as his left foot touched the shadow of the sign overhead, Shadow stopped and let out a single calm bark. Eli looked up at the sound and smiled. The field erupted in applause. Ruth, watching from her chair, closed her eyes tighter. A single tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek as she whispered, "A miracle isn't loud, it's faithful. It stays when the world walks away." Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned tangerine, Jack handed Megan a printed version of his journal, now bound in hardcover. The title had been updated, Shadow and Eli. A Year of Becoming. Megan turned its pages with gentle fingers. "You captured everything she said." "Not everything," Jack replied. "Just what needed remembering." That night they lit bonfires and roasted marshmallows. Kevin brought out his old guitar, and to everyone's surprise, Travis sang, not perfectly, not loudly, but when Eli giggled at the end of the song, Travis's voice cracked with something too strong for words. Shadow lay beside the fire with Eli curled up against him, fast asleep, his head on the dog's side, like a pillow made of breath and warmth. No one moved to disturb them, not even Ruth, who simply looked up at the stars and whispered, "He was the bridge." And so, under the watchful sky, and in the quiet warmth of a small Appalachian field, a boy who had once known only stillness walked, laughed, and dreamed, because one dog never gave up, and neither did the people who loved them both. Sometimes miracles don't arrive in lightning or loud hallelujahs. Sometimes they come on quiet paws and tiny hands learning to move again, or in the faithful eyes of a dog who refuses to give up Eli's journey. Reminds us that healing is not always sudden. It grows slowly like dawn, and sometimes it's not the medicine that moves us forward, but the love that refuses to leave our side. In our everyday lives, we may not all witness a paralyzed child learning to walk, but we do encounter moments that test our hope and patience. In those moments, may we remember Eli and Shadow. May we hold on to faith even when nothing makes sense, because God's work is not always loud, but it is always present. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and say, "Amen," if you believe that love, pure selfless love, is one of God's greatest miracles. And if you want more stories like this, full of healing faith and the bond between animals and people, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join this journey of grace. May God bless you and all those you love.